There is a persistent belief that any individual, against all odds, can make a difference. A romanticized notion that all you need is the will to win and an unwavering certainty in the righteousness of your cause. Because you don't need superpowers to be a hero, because one person can make a difference and every person must try, especially if that person is John Rambo. Hi, I'm Dan Larson and this is the history of Rambo, the Force of Freedom. Rambo, the Force of Freedom is a 65-episode animated series and action figure line from Coleco. It features a diverse team of American defenders of freedom led by Rambo, fighting back against the global terrorist organization Savage, led by General Warhawk. Hoo boy, a cartoon about Rambo. The Rambo whose story began in 1972 with a book called First Blood by David Morrell. It was about a wandering Vietnam War veteran suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. The Rambo who gets arrested and ends up killing a bunch of cops, soldiers, and bystanders in his attempt to escape imprisonment, who settles on suicide by exchanging gunfire with his arresting officer while attempting to blow himself up with dynamite. The Rambo who, 10 years later, had a feature film also called First Blood, based on that same book, but with a more sympathetic narrative, still heavily focused on Rambo's PTSD and inability to adjust to life back home, betrayed by his country after they asked him to go to a foreign land, to fight, to lose, and to come home to be disposed of, spit on as a villain. A movie that spent 10 years in rewrite purgatory before going on to earn $125 million against a budget of $15 million, launching a new franchise for Sylvester Stallone, his second hit film of 1982 following Rocky III released earlier in the year, which did $270 million. Both franchises were destined to get sequels. In 1985, they would switch release positions, with Rambo First Blood Part 2 releasing in May and Rocky IV releasing in November. They would earn just over $300 million each as Stallone powered the fight against the Russians during the Cold War. On the strength of Rambo First Blood Part 2 fully establishing Rambo as a real American hero, it is no surprise that at least one toy company took a chance on the license, despite the degree of violence depicted in the films.
I warned you! I tell her!
Up to that point, violence and war had never been a disqualifier for content suitable for children. Why would that change now? Heck, G.I. Joe had already aired 65 episodes over 3 years with the same mission statement. If anything, Rambo was just riding Joe's coattails. Stallone was hot. Kids like war and guns and stuff. It didn't matter that Rambo was an R-rated movie franchise. Coleco wasn't trying to sell movie tickets. They were trying to tap into the Stallone selling power. Rocky, Rambo, punching bad guys, blowing crap up. One fundamentally invincible man against the world with his trusty knife, his trusty sneer, and his trusty M60 machine gun, doling out freedom cartridges to everyone around the world.
Savage is attacking!
Once we take these pieces, Hilo, we'll rule the world, General Warhawk.
We need Rambo!
Rambo, the Force of Freedom.
Here's a present, Havoc. Wow! Rambo, behind you! Warhawk! Rambo, my sword. Look out! You again!
Rambo, the Force of Freedom.
Get Rambo and General Warhawk with their battle-action weapons, each sold separately.
Philosophically, operationally, Rambo was essentially just an extension of G.I. Joe as far as toys were concerned, further emphasized in 1985 when Hasbro introduced Sergeant Slaughter as the Joe's drill instructor. Sergeant Slaughter was almost followed by the introduction of the Rocky Balboa as the Joe's physical training instructor in 1987, if not for the creation of the Rambo line of figures by Coleco. Instead, that roster slot went to NFL superstar, Chicago Bears defensive tackle William the Refrigerator Perry. In 1986, Coleco released that line of Rambo action figures. Rambo was heading into battle with a new support squad featuring U.S. Air Force Academy graduate Edward Turbo Hayes, mechanical engineer / race car driver. Catherine Ann Cat Taylor, master of disguise, martial arts, and gymnastics, Rambo's Green Beret commanding officer and friend Colonel Troutman, and White Dragon, a ninja of course, because the 80s. They were up against General Warhawk and the forces of Savage, which included Sergeant Havoc, Gripper, Mad Dog, and Nomad, each with their own distinguished background related to, what was it? Special Administrators of Vandalism, Age Discrimination, Gouging, and Ethics Violations?
Nailed it.
Stallone was money, yes, and Coleco was pretty sure that parents were taking kids to see the movie despite the R rating. They were confident that Rambo was becoming an American pop icon, a powerful, heroic figure that kids could relate to and would be able to see themselves in as part of the play pattern. And not for nothing, but LJN had already jumped into the Rambo for kids market with their line of Entertech realistic motorized water guns in 1985. A whole line of Rambo branded guns was released in coordination with the premiere of Rambo First Blood Part 2. Coleco's marketing strategy included the creation of a cartoon to promote the toys, just like all the other toy companies were doing. Ruby Spears were veterans of cartoon production and no stranger to positioning toy advertisements as 22-minute narratives 65 times a year. As Michael Chain, head writer and story editor, explained in a 2015 interview with pop culture website Topless Robot, Coleco basically dropped the toys on his lap and let him do whatever he wanted to. Quote, "Well, I was given a set of villains, a set of heroes, and a group of toys, and the idea was to do whatever we wanted as long as the toys got shown. This was a huge toy project. There was a ton of money involved in toys and promotion. I mean, there was so much fun stuff. They created a whole line of Rambo forts and Rambo trucks and weapons and figures. When you're making toys, it's all about what has good play value for the kids. So I basically had carte blanche to do anything I wanted. And since I hired a team of fabulous writers for the show, we were able to do some amazing stuff." End quote. Rambo featured the voice talents of animation all-stars like Neil Ross, who was also playing Shipwreck across town on G.I. Joe, not to mention Ace McCloud on Centurion, Springer on Transformers, Herc Armstrong and Hector Ramirez on Inhumanoids, and also like 6 other shows. James Avery voiced Turbo on Rambo and Junkyard Dog on Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling. He would later go on to roles like Shredder on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Uncle Phil on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. On top of that, Alan Skeletor Oppenheimer, Peter Optimus Prime Cullen, and Frank Megatron Welker, all-star cast might not have been a generous enough description. The opening of the animated series draws heavily from the trailer for Rambo First Blood Part 2. Shot for shot in parts, it even uses the same Jerry Goldsmith music, something unique to a cartoon licensed from a feature film property. All the other music was handled by the incomparable Haim Saban and Shuki Levy, who wrote and composed music for practically every cartoon released during the 80s and 90s. And while, yes, that statement is an exaggeration, I'm confident that it is more right than wrong. You can't make a cartoon about war stuff and not ruffle a few feathers. And in the 80s, making cartoons about anything intended to sell toys to kids became kind of an issue. Tie all that up with a rated R bow.
Baby, you got a stew going.
By 1986, there had been cartoons adapted from comic book characters, video games, novels, celebrities, but none of them had ever crossed the line into rated R territory. How much violence any cartoon could show was a constant concern for producers. It's why so few lasers in G.I. Joe ever struck their target, or struck anything. It's why you always see parachutes when an aircraft is shot down, why everyone wears a seatbelt. Why if something gets punched, it's probably a robot. Rambo is also a rare case where the writers were clever enough to focus on the action more than the violence. In fact, episode for episode, there is less actual violence in Rambo than there is in G.I. Joe. According to Jack Bornoff in the same 2015 Topless Robot interview, before Rambo went into production, they used G.I. Joe as a template of what not to do. Quote, "Joe Ruby assigned me to watch a bunch of G.I. Joe episodes and keep track of what was considered violent content so we could avoid that kind of trouble," end quote. That Kind of Trouble was a nonprofit organization called Action for Children's Television. It was created in 1968 in response to a perceived lack of diversity of content in children's television programming, as well as a concern for the quantity and representation of advertising on the programs that did exist. Through the 60s and 70s, the organization took an active role lobbying Congress to implement rules for the types of programming and advertising that were directed at children. Ideally, they sought for ad-free programs and a healthy representation of educational programming, shows like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood or Sesame Street. With the beginning of the Reagan administration in 1980, a whole lot of regulations got chucked right out the window. A lot of the progress that had been made was undone. The market was left to decide what was going to be sold to kids based on what those kids and their parents decided to purchase, and we bought it all. But even in that environment of deregulation, ACT still fought to protect kids from overzealous corporations. Kids, they felt, didn't know the degree to which they were being manipulated by the shows they were watching and the messages those shows were communicating, all in the interest of selling toys or games or a cereal made out of tiny chocolate chip cookies. Rambo brought a whole different kind of baggage to the scene. R rating, a prominent storyline involving the horrors of the Vietnam War, post-traumatic stress disorder, political and social commentary through lightly veiled storylines based on contemporary places and people. But Rambo is Rambo, one man against the odds with the will to win and unwavering certainty in the righteousness of his cause. According to Mike Chain, Rambo, the Force of Freedom, quote, pulled the highest ratings that had ever been pulled for a cartoon like that. They were pulling primetime numbers for an animated show. He continues, unfortunately, it ended up killing us because it attracted the attention of Peggy Charon and Action for Children's Television. They got us involved in all the politics. ABC was scared of getting death threats and people talking about violence in children's television and all that stuff. And it was just horsepucky, because in all 65 episodes of Rambo, no one ever gets hurt, let alone killed, with the exception of Rambo himself, who breaks an arm falling out of an airplane in one episode. End quote. But the negative publicity was enough to give their network, ABC, a case of the yips. Even though the ratings were there, the toys were selling, the show was buried in a 4 a.m. time slot to ride out the rest of the contract. ABC did what Savage could never do: kill the Rambo. Spoiler alert, the general Rambo pop culture phenomenon didn't die with the cancellation of Rambo, the Force of Freedom. Heck, the toy line itself was still on the shelves in 1987. Rambo First Blood Part 2, a game based on the film, was released for the Sega Master System in 1986, and then in 1987 for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Rambo, based on Rambo First Blood Part 2 and Rambo 3, was a two-player arcade shooting game released in 2008, not to mention all the games that were released based on these successive films in the franchise. If you missed Rambo the Force of Freedom the first time around, you can watch all 65 episodes on DVD, released by Lionsgate Home Entertainment in 2005, and it occasionally pops up for sale or rent on various online streaming services. Rambo would be called back to service by his country 3 more times in 1988 for Rambo 3, 2008 for Rambo, and 2019 for Rambo Last Blood, each episode decreasing the likelihood that the Force of Freedom would ever be rebooted as a cartoon ever again, if you know what I mean. Rambo the Force of Freedom was a unique product of a specific time in history. Movie franchises had been adapted like Star Wars Ewoks and droids, but everything changed in 1986. That single year saw Chuck Norris, Ghostbusters, and Teen Wolf joining Rambo as movie-related properties recreated for kids, redefined to sell toys, comic books, video games, cereal, and pajamas. But Rambo stood unique above them all as an R-rated character made PG, driven by writers trying to tell action-packed stories about a powerful American hero, attempting to impart moral lessons. Trying to help entertain a generation of kids while haunted by the specter of violence and political controversy associated with a name, a man, a hero. Rambo. Thanks for watching. Please hit like, hit subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. Thank you very much to those of you who already are. If you're in the position to help the channel grow, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/toygalaxy or become a channel member at youtube.com/toygalaxytv/join. Both Patreon and YouTube channel membership have the same exclusive content, so choose your own adventure. Please share this video and let us know in the comments down below if you'd be willing to follow cartoon Rambo into combat, knowing that once that shirt came off, it was basically a superhero, leaping from helicopter to helicopter, dodging bullets, punching robots. Oh, and surprise, the shirt was always off.
No, cut.